The World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab's team, anoints Charles III, the British King, the Great Reset King. For decades, attempts have been made to use climate change to justify radical policy changes, but the Great Reset is the most ambitious and radical plan the world has seen in generations, and we're getting our first taste of its crippling agenda in our skyrocketing fuel and energy bills. In June 2020, the World Economic Forum, WEF, and then Prince Charles launched the Great Reset. In an article announcing the launch, Klaus Schwab wrote that, quote, all aspects of our societies and economies must be revamped, and, quote, from education and social contracts and working conditions, every country from the United States to China must participate, and every industry from oil and gas to technology must be transformed. In short, we need a great reset of capitalism. Not to be outdone, Charles said, we have a golden opportunity to see something good from this coronavirus crisis. Its unprecedented shockwaves may well make people more receptive to big visions of change. It's an opportunity we have never had before and may never have again, he said. Which is interesting, because a few years before Charles' billionaire family, the Windsors, tried to use a state poverty fund to help heat their palaces, according to The Independent, quote, aides complained to ministers in 2004 that the Queen's gas and electricity bills, which had increased by 50% that year, stood at more than £1 million a year and had become untenable. Keeping Buckingham Palace's heating bill in mind, while King Charles and Klaus Schwab's eco-fascist Great Reset drives our cost of living even higher, plunging many more in poverty, rules for thee and not for me. And while the WEF are trying to force you to eat bugs, insects, and crickets, it would make sense to pay heed to what they are eating themselves, which in this case of this 20-year veteran of the WEF includes some of the finest cuts of meat money can buy. Shortly after the launch of the Great Reset, The Hill wrote, although many details about the Great Reset won't be rolled out until the World Economic Forum meets in Davos January 2021, the general principles of the plan are clear. The world needs massive new government programs and far-reaching policies, or put it another way, we need a form of socialism. Now that more details have been revealed, we would argue the Great Reset, quote-unquote, is more like a radical form of totalitarian communism. In January 2020, 6 months before the launch of the Great Reset, Charles attended WEF's annual meeting in Davos for the first time in 30 years. And Charles said this, it is WEF's mission to improve the state of the world and the urgent need to shape the next 50 years that has inspired me to be with you here today after an absence of 30 years. We are in the midst of a crisis that is now, I hope, well understood. Global warming, climate change, and the devastating loss of biodiversity are the greatest threats humanity has ever faced, Charles said. Charles launched 3 related instruments at Davos 2020. The Terra Carta, the Sustainable Markets Initiative, and the Sustainable Markets Council. And don't underestimate Charles. When the Great Reset was officially launched in June 2020, it was not by Schwab's or Bill Gates, but by Charles, then Prince of Wales and heir apparent to the British throne. In June 3, 2020, an ominous date for those interested in gematria can now be understood as day 0 for the Great Reset. Charles' official website announced on June 3, 2020, quote, today, through HRH's Sustainable Markets Initiative and the World Economic Forum, the Prince of Wales launched a new global initiative, the Great Reset, end quote. And a royal tweet declared, hashtag the Great Reset Initiative is designed to ensure businesses and communities build back better by putting sustainable businesses practices at the heart of their operations as they begin to recover from the coronavirus pandemic. WEF released a video on the same day to mark the launch of the Great Reset, and in it, Charles stressed that the plan included green policies that would suffocate businesses and individual freedoms worldwide, is a matter of urgency, and he noted that this would involve net zero carbon emissions and the use of carbon pricing to achieve it. And according to the World Bank, quote, carbon pricing is an instrument that captures the external costs of greenhouse gas GHG emissions, the costs of emissions that the public pays for, such as damage to crops, healthcare costs for heat waves and droughts, and loss of property from flooding and sea level rise, and ties them to the sources through a price, usually in the form of a price on the carbon dioxide CO2 emitted. And the World Bank Carbon Price Dashboard mentions this. Essentially, it is a carbon dioxide tax, a price tag on all aspects of our lives and ultimately all life on Earth. We, as with all aerobic life, whether on land, in the air, or in the water, emit carbon dioxide as a byproduct of respiration or when we exhale. Breathing is a natural, necessary part of life. How far is their proposed carbon tax prepared to go? What price will they put on our heads, and who benefits financially? The answers to these questions are open-ended, but if you have been paying attention to workings of the COVID pandemic, you will not be surprised to learn that Charles has been positioning the British monarchy to take control, capitalize, and benefit from the carbon taxes the WEF intends to enforce. Strangely, on the WEF's YouTube channel, there is only a short excerpt of Charles' 5-minute speech to mark the launch of the Great Reset. Was Charles too honest in his historical video? The WEF have a history of covering their tracks when information is deemed unfavorable to their agenda. Is that why Charles' video, the launch video, has been cut? So make no mistake, Charles, the eco-fascist, is a threat to humanity as we know it. As the Telegraph reported last week, Charles will continue to push the green agenda from the throne. However, he will highlight rather than campaign in the manner he's done for decades. In his first televised address to the nation last Friday, Charles said, it will no longer be possible for me to give so much of my time and energies to the charities and issues for which I care so deeply, but I know this important work will go on in the trusted hands of others. As the Telegraph reported, it's unlikely the monarch will attend COP27. It's also unlikely that he will abandon his life's work. Charles' Global War, the video recorded for the launch of Climate Week in New York, September 2020, Charles called for a new Marshall-like plan, to fight global climate change, a reference to the US plan to aid Europe after World War II. At COP26, he escalated this warlike rhetoric, calling for a military-style campaign. He said, we need a vast military-style campaign to marshal the strength of the global private sector with trillions at his disposal for beyond global GDP, and with the greatest respect beyond even the governments of the world's leaders, it offers the only real prospect of achieving fundamental economic transition, he said. Is Charles calling for the global private sector to remove the authority of national governments, who are our elected representatives, and take charge through military-style action, hence a coup d'etat? Is Charles calling for the end of sovereignty to be replaced by WEF transhumanist fascism? On behalf of humanity, we can say no thank you, Charles. No to your carbon tax or any other money-making scheme to profit from life itself, and no to your conflicts. This is by Baxter Dimitri on Newspunch. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.